Hi everyone, my name's Matthew. Welcome back to this little series of videos in the start of John's Gospel, thinking about connecting with God. Who, how, why, what difference does it make? And Christians like me, we make enormous claims about who Jesus is. Even in this short series of videos, we've said that God is knowable, that Jesus is God introducing himself to the world, that Jesus came to offer rescue, relationship with God, forgiveness of sins. These are huge claims. And whether you'd call yourself a Christian or not, I wonder whether you struggle with the fact that you can't see Jesus. John said that Jesus came as public news, that the world might see him and believe. But what do we do with the fact that we can't see him now? If you're a Christian, maybe you think, keeping on in faith would be so much easier if I just saw Jesus once. Or if you're not a Christian, maybe you think, how could I possibly believe in Jesus if I haven't met him? How do we believe without seeing? And John's answer, I think we'll see in this passage, is eyewitness testimony. Our lives are filled with eyewitness testimony, from the friends that we ask what happened in the class that we missed, to the news reports that we read to keep up with the world, from the books that we read to tell us about the past and places that we haven't been, to the justice system that we rely on. Our lives are filled with eyewitness testimony because we can't be everywhere, see everything, check everything for ourselves. And especially this is true about things that happened in the past. You can't drop in on Julius Caesar to ask him a question. Now Jesus was a real person, on show to everyone willing to look, who did real historical things to back up the claims that were made about him, chief of all rising from the dead. Now maybe we can't be there to see Jesus, but in this passage of John's Gospel, John introduces some people who were, some eyewitnesses. These ordinary Jewish believers, these disciples, were people who had the chance to follow Jesus around for the whole of his ministry, to hear what he taught, to see what he did, to do all the things that we'd want to do. What did these witnesses make of Jesus? I think John wants us to see today that the disciples were convinced who Jesus was. The disciples were convinced who Jesus was. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Something about Jesus convinced Philip to drop everything and follow a man he had only just met. Something about Jesus convinced Philip, a pious Jew, that he had found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote. He was convinced that this man was the person the whole Jewish scripture pointed to, that he was the rescuing king that the Jewish people had been waiting for hundreds of years. And this wasn't a short-term follow me. Philip, Nathanael, Andrew, Peter. John is writing names that the first readers of the gospel would recognise. They're the people that you sometimes see on the walls of churches or in Renaissance art. These men didn't follow for a year and then go back to their lives. They followed Jesus right up to his death. And after his resurrection, they spent the whole of their lives telling people what they'd seen about Jesus, even at the risk of death. Something they saw convinced them that following Jesus was worth dropping everything. What could possibly convince them of that? Don't you want to see what they saw? And even more, Philip was convinced enough that the very first thing that he did was go and tell his friend Nathanael to come and see Jesus too. I'm sure you've been sent one of these surveys after buying something. Say you've bought a new Wi-Fi subscription or a pack of butter from a new shop, and they send you a survey and it says, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend? Unlikely, likely, very likely. You always put unlikely, right? I mean, who talks to their friends about Wi-Fi or butter? It would have to be a really exciting thing for you to even think about telling your friends about it. Imagine how exciting this must have been, that the very first thing that Philip did was go and tell his friend Nathanael. Philip must have been very convinced about who Jesus was. Don't you want to see what he saw? As an aside, unless you were recommended it by YouTube, you're probably watching this video because a friend asked you to. Maybe you're even watching it reluctantly. But perhaps consider how convinced they must be of Jesus' identity and his importance to even consider asking you to watch this. Maybe ask them about that. But back to the witnesses. And disciples like Philip were convinced who Jesus was. Something they saw convinced them that Jesus was worth dropping everything to follow. What could possibly have convinced them of that? Don't you want to see what they saw? Well, John here is really teasing the rest of his gospel because the eyewitnesses actually wrote down what they saw. And the rest of these chapters, you can read what they saw. You can read what they saw. Let's read on the passage. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." So Nathanael comes along and Jesus is able to tell him what sort of fruit tree he took his morning nap under. And that's proof enough for sceptical Nathanael. But I wonder if you find yourself a little underwhelmed. That's more Darren Brown than God himself. And I think Jesus agrees with you. By promising his disciples that they'll see greater things, he's saying a little bit of remote bodily isn't enough. I've claimed to be God and I'll prove it. When he says you'll see angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man, he's promising these ordinary disciples that they'll see heaven meeting earth. And John, describing this in chapter 1, is essentially saying, read on and you'll see these things that we saw. John's gospel is eyewitness testimony. These eyewitnesses saw Jesus, they were convinced who he was, and you can read what they saw. The Gospels are eyewitness testimony by people who saw Jesus, who saw these greater things that he was talking about, and spent their whole lives telling people about them. They wrote down what they saw for people far away and for people like us in the future. And as you read that eyewitness testimony, you'll meet a man who claimed to be God, doing things that only God could do. You'll meet a man who claimed to offer life to all who believe, bring life to a dead man, and even rise from the dead himself. And you'll meet a man whose love and character is so compelling that billions of people across thousands of years have wanted to and felt able to call him friend. You can read what the disciples saw. I realise at this point you may have concerns as to whether the Gospels really are eyewitness testimony, and if that's a problem you have, I'd love to recommend this little book called Can We Trust the Gospels by a Cambridge academic called Peter Williams. In it, he shows that the people who wrote the Gospels had in-depth local knowledge of the areas, geography, names and culture of the places that are being described in the Gospels. That's the sort of knowledge that you could only get if you were a local person in the age without Google. These Gospels bear all the marks of eyewitness testimony. And if your problem is miracles, if the thought of the greater things that Jesus was describing just makes you cringe, perhaps consider what would happen if God himself, were he to exist, stepped into the world. Surely you'd expect the abnormal. We can't see Jesus now, so how do we believe without seeing, is the question that we had at the start. And John's answer is to introduce some eyewitnesses, some people who saw Jesus and were convinced. And we don't have to wonder what they saw, what convinced them to drop everything and follow him for the whole of their lives. They wrote it down, eyewitness testimony that we can read and see Jesus. How do we believe without seeing? Read on in John's Gospel. Let me close with some words from the very end of John's Gospel, his purpose statement, his reason for writing almost. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. We're taking a short break from making these videos, but in a couple of weeks we'll be back with John chapter 2, where we'll start to see these greater things that Jesus was talking about, these things by which he proved he was who he says he was. See you then.